Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. It's really fantastic to have you here to kick off today's Climate Day of Action. It's really great that we're having this panel this morning to kick it off, because I think it's so important to ensure that our conversations around the climate movement remain decolonial and to combat the whitewashing that often happens in this movement. So just a brief introduction of myself. I'm Khadija, I'm chair of the BAME network. So I've been elected to represent Black and Asian minority ethnic students at the University in SU, and have been working on decolonizing the curriculum and other aspects of the university. So today is the Climate Day of Action. The Climate Emergency Day of Action marks the end of Sustainability Month. It's been timetabled into the university calendar, and it is the first time that climate action has been prioritised over usual educational activity by the University of Bristol. Bristol SU and the University of Bristol have worked collaboratively to encourage students, staff and members of the public to participate in activities related to the climate emergency and increase understanding of the challenges we currently face. Virtual events will be programmed throughout the day, including panel discussions, teach outs, a people's assembly and keynote speakers. And I just think it's fantastic that this is being prioritised over the timetable, because I think it's really important that even though we're here virtually, the climate change continues to be an emergency, and that's not going to stop because of COVID. So today's event is going to consist of some planned questions for our excellent panelists, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So just a reminder throughout this event to put questions in the Q&A box, and so we can pick them up and feed them into our panelists. So I'm going to start off by welcoming each of our panelists in turn. So firstly, we have Dr. Rose Craig, and she is the founder and president of Black to Nature, and runs an organisation called Bird Girl UK. Hi.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. Next, we have Councillor Cleo Lake, who is the Councillor for Cotham and is a Deputy Green Group Leader.
Greetings, everyone. I'm not currently the deputy leader, but yeah, more things besides, but great to be here.
Sorry, thanks. So next we have Penina, and she is involved in the African Voices Forum.
Thank you, Khadija.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Next we have Safia, and she is a Bristol alumni and is a People and Planet activist.
Hi, thank you for having me.
No worries. And then last but not least, we have Olivia, who is a Black and Green ambassador.
Hiya, nice to be here.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Associate Professor Frank Matos was going to join us. He was the co-director of the Environmental Humanities South at Cape Town University, but he had an unforeseen clash in his calendar, so wasn't able to join us, but we definitely appreciated him being up for it. So we're going to start off with some planned questions, but as I said, a reminder to please submit any other questions you have using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I just want to start off by asking Cleo, why is the perception of the climate movement so whitewashed?
Well, it's a question we hear a lot. Obviously, it's been very topical for a couple of years. And in part, that is due to mainstream media and, you know, the narratives that are put out there, which most of us are exposed to. We are seeing new material come through, new movements, new people, such as the Black and Green ambassadors and everyone here really who's doing work to change that narrative. But I think it is also kind of trying to step away in some ways from this whole notion of decolonization. It's become a buzzword really, and I always have reservations about that, because we know that the accurate narrative is that people of colour, Indigenous communities, the Global South has been at the forefront of resisting the climate emergency from day one, really, when we consider the history of this, which is really based on colonialism and the ravaging of resources and people on the planet. So I think now it's about really reframing and actually making sure that we don't fall into the trap of existing in geographical silos, and that we actually connect globally back to our own communities, whether that's the African heritage community or, you know, the Indian diaspora, etc. It's really important that we're able to reconnect and understand that we are global communities.
Thanks, Cleo, and really echo your statement about it not being performative, because I think it's so important that we don't just talk about this, but we act too. So next I'm going to ask, seeing as you mentioned the Black and Green ambassadors, Olivia, to answer the question.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Cleo has said in all senses. I think the climate movement is whitewashed because it's the history we're taught, it's the media we consume, and it's the people in the world who have power to tell their stories and have a voice. I think the media has this kind of, it likes a star activist, a single person to be the face of something, and that's instantly a problem for representation. And when I talk about history, I think, you know, at least for me, until I started teaching myself, almost, you know, finding out different stories and finding out that true story, in my head, the climate movement kind of began in the 60s and 70s with the hippie movement, and that's just not the case at all. There's so much more out there, but once you kind of attach those two things together, that perpetuates a very particular image, and then it kind of, you know, it's that cycle that keeps going. And because you see a certain image out there, why would you want to get involved in something that doesn't feel like it's for you? And also, not only are people being kept out, but people don't want to come in because there's such a, you know, a particular exclusivity to that why would you want to be part of that in some ways as well? So I think it's a bit of everything. And breaking it down, I think, is, as Cleo said, it's not just about decolonizing, and it's not just about these kind of buzzwords in this movement in this instant, but it's about realizing that the climate movement isn't a singular entity, and it doesn't sit separate from kind of life. It is one and the same, and it is for everyone.
Thank you so much. I love that it's not a separate entity and we have to incorporate into all aspects of our life. Penina?
Yeah, I think that for me, it just, it's encapsulated in what Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is an African writer, and he wrote about the politics of language in African literature, and he linked that to decolonizing of the mind. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, the effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, and in the heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. And I think that is what the whitewashing has really, you know, put as its foundation, to annihilate all of these things within the cultural perspective of Indigenous communities. So I don't think that you can put it any better than that.
Thank you for sharing that. Really summed it up powerfully. Maya?
I absolutely echo what everyone else has said so far, and I think also because of this history of colonization that we're still really working through in a lot of our identities, I think in places like Britain and America, there's also this feeling of intellectual superiority and therefore moral superiority over countries in the global south, where they feel like, because they're Western countries, they're the ones who are the experts on you know, on climate change, on environmental issues, despite a lot of the time them being the ones who have created these issues, and the global south being the countries that are taking the impact for that. But I think also there is this absolute, I suppose, ignorance of the fact, like, because a lot of these are very white liberal spaces, and I think that it's a very, very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people in the environmental movement, in the climate movement, to acknowledge that there might still be that lingering history of colonialism, that there might still be racism essentially in their environmental work, because they really, really don't like the idea of that, which I think is one of the reasons these conversations around decolonialization are only just starting to crop up, like you said, in the last few years.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I agree. One of the issues is that it can be uncomfortable, especially when you think you're part of a progressive movement. And finally, Safia?
Yes, I mean, to echo what everyone has been saying, I think it's the narrative that we are spreading is such an important point of why the climate movement is so whitewashed. And I feel like there's this tendency in climate movements to have this sort of apocalyptic and it affects everyone sort of discourse, which is ultimately true, but it doesn't take into account the political nature of climate change, you know. And even though now we maybe have some climate movements which acknowledge capitalism as the cause of climate change, there is such a poor mention of the fact that, as everyone has been saying, this is a result of a system which has been built on racial capitalist exploitation. This is why we need to consider the racial component on it. And I think the most important thing that I wanted to mention for this question is the sort of environmental conservation model that we have that is essentially colonial, and which is a huge problem in wildlife conservation plans. And since we have this idea in many protected sites, especially protected by the UNESCO, that essentially environmental protection is best achieved when there is no human disturbance, which makes that you have indigenous people which cannot access their ancestral lands. And this is something which is very, very problematic, because the only human interaction which is legitimate is tourism and safari hunting, and indigenous people cannot access their lands. And actually something which I am researching during my internship is the fact that you have environmental destruction which is pinpointed to indigenous people who have a communal and a sustainable approach to their land. And you have states, especially on the African continent, which are saying that this is because of them and therefore we should keep them away from their territories. But at the same time, these states are allowing projects such as mining and ecocidal projects to happen. So I think this sort of like colonial model of conservation needs to change, since it's essentially racist. Thank you so much, and that fantastic reminder about the importance of considering Indigenous lands in this really links nicely to our next question, which is, how has the legacy of colonialism and racism impacted climate change? And I'm going to start with Maya Rose.
I think all of this has had a massively negative impact on the climate change movement and on the wider environmental movement. Again, going back to what I was talking about this feeling of intellectual superiority, that has the knock-on effect of people in these Western spaces refusing to listen to the voices of people in, in countries in the global South. So an example I talk about a lot is Bangladesh, just because it's a country that's massively suffering from the impact of climate change, but it's also a country where a lot of my family is from historically. And one of the key things that I've noticed is because there's sort of this broader aspect of it being that country's fault, there's so many people there, they don't have industries that are good for the environment. They're ignoring the fact that that has been caused by Western countries historically, but that also means that they refuse to let these countries, I suppose, enact their own solutions and push them into a box. And basically what I'm trying to say is I feel like it's massively held back the climate change movement from progressing and evolving, and we're stuck in basically the place we were 10 years ago in terms of our ideas on how to solve these issues. Yeah, sorry.
No, thank you. And I think it's really useful here that you've spoken on your own, the way this links to your own family and how that comes into your work, because I think that's really important, how family and our cultural values play into everything we do. So Penina, do you want to answer the question next?
Yeah, I think that for me, probably the biggest impact of this from the West is, these big corporations that go into the African continent to grab a lot of land, specifically trying to take through some of African resources, even after colonialism, as part of as a continuation of the neo-colonialism period. And I think that because of that, the other side of this, and I think that I have to sort of draw attention to the fact that resistance, as Cleo mentioned, resistance has always been there. It started in the African continent during the period of the enslavement and trafficking of people of African descent. We saw different forms of resistance from different African people, like Queen Zinga, King Agaja, Abdullah Kadir from Senegal, and Dahomey, and all of these were forms of resistance that have continued to take root. So even though we still have these big corporations coming in and continue to sort of use the land in the way that they want, and obviously the impact of climate change has been much more impactful in Africa, and especially I'll give you an example, like in Mozambique, when we had the flooding with the cyclone Idai when it hit, and that has continuously paralyzed the city in terms of it trying to regenerate itself. But the other side of this is that there is still a growing movement in Africa. You know, there's organizations like Greenpeace Africa who are very, very much driving campaigns on creative confrontation to expose environmental injustices. Recently, I've been part of the MTM Awards, which is an award that that has been sort of showcased in Bristol, where they look at contributions from Black and Asian communities, specifically from an international perspective. And I was very pleased to see that they had a new category called environmental excellence. And there was 7 different organizations that were put forward from Kenya, specifically where young people are driving the environmental campaign. You know, some of them are from the age of 18. A good example of a young girl called Anita Sonia. She's already written a book called My Green War. And there she talks about the injustices and also looks at different ways of countering it. I was really impressed by some of the applications that came through on that. And I'm really pleased that, you know, for the first time, visibility of movements in Africa are actually being put out there, because so we cannot say that they are less active. It's just that the visibility and the stage and the fact that we have celebrity status being given to certain white people who are seen as being active in that area actually makes us less visible. But it doesn't mean that we are not there in the front line.
Thank you so much. And I love the way you've highlighted that often it's an active suppression. It's not unconscious, it's actively, that there is an active colonial force that is oppressing these groups and organizations from people of color. And therefore we need those active solutions to empower them again. Next, it would be great, Safia, if you want to answer the question.
Yes, just to double check, because you froze when you asked the question, was it on the legacy of colonialism and
yeah, how has the legacy of colonialism and racism impacted climate change?
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I got the question right. Yeah, I feel like, I mean, this is such an important point, and this is sort of the key of, you know, like this sort of speeches. Like, we need to understand that the root causes of climate change, as I said earlier, is racial capitalism. And my area of interest is especially understanding how you have the exploitation of nature, which mirrors the which mirrors racism and essentially racial exploitation, since we live in a system which is based on private property. And this private property paradigm makes that we have this approach to nature as we are the owner of it. This is nature that is here to serve us, and nature which is a thing which we can just possess. And this is sort of the same dynamic as, for example, what was using the safe holding system. And I feel like this whole paradigm needs to change, and this is why we now have this climate crisis, because this colonial system was, as I think Mayra said earlier, was enforced by Western powers upon the global South, and this is sort of the development idea that we have now, that to be like a prosperous country, you need to have economic structures which are here to be industrialized, which needs to be productivist. And this system is now being kept in place by institutions such as the obviously institutional financial institutions like the World Bank, but also the UN, which to call for development or not calling for sustainable development. They have this ideal of modernity, which is that you need to produce, you need to possess. And this is why I think it's, again, this might be all very, very theoretical, and this is why it's so great that we have actual, like, also some examples from other people in some countries. But in general, this this approach we have to nature that needs to change if we want to understand how racism plays into climate change.
Thank you so much. So powerful. And again, a reminder to us all that this is something that is actively killing people of colour. And I think we sometimes forget about that in the conversations we have when they're purely theoretical. Cleo?
Yeah, I think it's important to reflect that not only do we endure racism, white supremacy, but we're constantly being denied the right to be heard on the matter of our own history, the right to be heard regarding the atrocities and crimes against humanity and against the planet that have been committed, which also means that we are being denied the right to repair. It's important to remember that we are talking about, when we think of enslavement and colonialism, it's actually, and particularly sometimes when you reflect on the American journey, it's something that is still in, or time-wise just out of living memory. So it wasn't that long ago. There are people still alive who can remember much of that barbaric period. And of course, Bristol was responsible for a lot of that. It was embedded in many of the so-called colonies of the US and others, in particular places like Virginia, which commemorated its 400th anniversary in 2019, which was countered in some way with the initiative of the Year of Return in Ghana, which called back much of its diaspora. I think also, if we reflect on the toppling of the Colston statue last year and the effect that it had and still has worldwide, let's remember that days later, Columbus's statue was also toppled in the US, and that there are communities in Trinidad, indigenous and of African heritage, who are also fighting to remove the narrative and the myth of Columbus from their city landscape, from their educational institutions, and from their psyche. Indigenous communities who were not, as we were told, wiped out by the Europeans, but are still very much alive, still very much fighting, as they have from day one, fighting for the right to exist, fighting for the right of their connection to their spirit, their spiritual connection to land, water, and air. Columbus and his so-called voyage was, for many indigenous communities, the First World War, and it should be framed as such, particularly when we talk about this climate emergency that we're in, this emergency, let's be frank, of the end of the planet. Humanity is on its knees and the planet is going with it. But I think also it's the assimilation, which is the colonization of the mind of people and of their severance from their spiritual belief systems and group identity. And that is a pressing priority and must be the most important aspect of decolonization, if we're going to frame it that way.
Thanks, Kia. That was, I have nothing to add. That was so powerful. Olivia?
I don't think I could have anything to add after everyone's just spoken and following Cleo. So I'll keep it brief because, you know, all those ideas and statements are absolutely true and amazingly powerful. I would almost reframe the question and say, I wouldn't say it's impacted. I would say without one, there wouldn't be the other. And I think I would also add into that the role that misogyny has played in climate change as well. It's colonialism, it's racism, and it's misogyny. And there's lots of movement that draws the direct link between colonialism and ecocide and genocide. And I feel like that extractivist nature, this notion that more is better, is from the West and colonialism. And without that nature being embedded as what success looks like, we just wouldn't be in the place that we are today. And I believe if people have true power and agency and choices about their local environment, we would be in a very different place to where we are now. Colonialism and racism, I think, is also holding back the radical change, as Myro's alluded to, that we need to start acting against this emergency that's very real. We refuse to listen to or give equal credence to ideas from people, you know, from different people or from people who are truly experiencing the impacts of climate change now. So I think, yeah, I just think it's not an impact, it's the cause of in many ways.
Thank you so much. So the next question, we had a pre-planned question about like what can we do to decolonize the climate movement, but I just want to take, instead of that, kind of frame it in the way that people have asked in the live questions, where they've said, so one person, Poppy, said, how important is the youth voice in fighting for an actively anti-racist climate movement? And David has asked, how can students and staff activists in Bristol stand in solidarity with activists who are fighting the climate crisis in countries, primarily in the global south, that are being most impacted by the climate crisis? So I suppose like looking at like what we can do to be actively anti-racist and in solidarity with those countries, or activists in those countries, with a focus on kind of like the youth, students, staff at Bristol University. Penina, if you want to go first.
Sorry, Khadija, can you just reframe that for me?
Yeah, sure. It was a few. But so essentially the theme being an active anti-racist climate movement, and what particularly people, the young people, students and staff at Bristol University can do to stand in solidarity with activists of colour and be anti-racist. So like essentially what can we do, especially as students and staff at Bristol University?
I think that the universities can play a significant role, and I think this is really fixing very much on the knowledge systems that are currently seen as the right knowledge, because people have often felt that institutions are where you go to get your knowledge, but there's a lot of knowledge that comes from Indigenous communities that is buried in archives within universities across the globe. And I think that one of the projects that we've had with University of Bristol is around how we decolonize that language, and how we look at creating a new digital narrative which takes account of that Indigenous knowledge and archives all that in order to bring through a new transformation in terms of reconstructing knowledge. So I think that educational institutions such as Bristol University can actually encourage those young people who are currently coming into the system to go back into those archives and actually recreate those digital narratives and actually put them out there, so that we begin that whole journey. Cleo has referred to something we call healing. The healing process needs to go back to a place of innocence. When you start from a place of innocence, and then you acknowledge what has happened in the middle. And the middle bit is the oppressive nature, as we have seen it in very different formats. First of all, it was through enslavement. Now we saw it through the colonial system. We've seen it make its way through what is called racism, and we continue to live with those day-to-day experiences every day. Now we have to move to a place where we reconstruct all that, and we reform, and we almost try to learn from all of those experiences and begin that healing process by getting more young people involved in that sort of forward move for the sake of our ancestors.
Thank you so much. Olivia?
I think it's about learning histories, untold histories, as Penina has referred to, and telling other people that. And very much, I think, at least when I went to university, and a lot of the education system frames itself as this is absolute knowledge, and this is the way it is. So just, even if you can't tell the other story, just making sure that you're not saying this is the only story or this is the right way, encouraging that critical thinking and the search for something else. I think it's about celebrating culture and practice from around the world that has always been kind of sustainable or green, but just hasn't had the luxury of having that label. And I think for young people particularly, it's about not just drinking the Kool-Aid. You know, there's a lot of other ideas going on out there, and I think, I'm not that old, but I think especially people younger than me as well are already kind of exploring so much more, but not falling into the trap of just taking what people say as as the truth, or as the only version of the truth, or as the only narrative, and exploring what else is out there. And I think it's sad in a lot of ways that it's going to be, I feel like it's a lot of personal effort at this time. There's a lot of, relearning your own history. I'm very much a product of the British education system, and I'm still, grappling with how to unpick parts of that in the way I think and the way I act. So I think it's a lot of self-education at this point. And it's about creating support systems that allow that to happen while the kind of big system catches up with us.
Thank you so much. Cleo?
Yeah, of course, academia was in many ways set up to justify the crimes against humanity and the planet. So we must know that dismantling this systemic misinformation and extractive culture will take a critical mass of challenge and critical thinking. And some students will need to step away from everything they've ever thought about themselves and their place in the world in order to understand their place in the jigsaw and where we are now. Obviously, it's learning, but it's also unlearning. I would suggest that students do educate themselves, and there are resources out there. You are students, you are academics, if you like, you're in the academic field. This is part of your academic career. So try to link with things like the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, for example, and I will put these links in the chat. Equally, there is also a really good resource of education, a website called, and a movement, Stop the Maangamizi. Maangamizi is a Kiswahili word which tries to sum up the experience of African heritage people and planet in terms of a huge, great disaster. You can learn more about that on the website. Again, I'll post it in the chat. There's also a petition by Stop the Maangamizi, which is a charge to the British state of ecocide and genocide. And let's be clear, that's the extent of what's happened. Its allies are important. This is a movement and something that needs to happen, and as many of us as possible need to be involved because it affects all of us, regardless of our backgrounds and our ethnicities, our class, etc., etc. Some people will have more capacity to lend their arms, their ears, their pen, or whatever else to this movement, and that is going to be very, very much needed and welcomed. But do educate yourself. And it's been framed by some people actually sometimes, can we accept everyone just to say that they are an ally? Do they need to be in some ways vetted? Can anyone just spring up and say I'm an ally? Well, yes, in some ways, but also you do need to educate yourself. So I will put the resources in the chat. I think I'd just like to also perhaps put a positive spin on the end of this and say, if we think about resistance and activism in Bristol, we can reflect on the Bristol Bus Boycott, which happened about 10 years after the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was a collaboration between activists and campaigners of African Caribbean descent, but also students from Bristol Uni. That's what made it happen. They were the ones also demonstrating with placards out on the ground. So let's take heart from that and learn from some of the examples we've seen, such as that in the past, in terms of how it can inform our way forward.
Thanks, Cleo, and agree that there's a lot to look at in our history that can inspire us for positive change. Maya Rose?
Yeah, I think the question about the youth, the voice of youth in particular, was really interesting to me, just because I guess I question sometimes whether or not at the moment there's any difference particularly between the youth voice and the voice of everyone else in terms of the environmental movement, especially on issues like these, because I think a lot of the time, obviously, there's nothing inherently new or radical just from being younger. It's all, like people were saying, all about educating yourself, especially because issues like these, yeah, like Olivia said, are never going to be in the school curriculum. I know from my personal experiences as someone who left school last year, that there was a really big convenient gap in my history class that covered the entire timeline of the British Empire. It just wasn't covered at all. And I think because we have things like that going on in our education system, the main thing that a lot of people can do is go out and educate themselves about our history and about our past and about how that impacts people today. But I do think one thing that's really interesting is that young people who have educated themselves are often so willing to put themselves out there and be radical and push back against the more traditional groups in the environmental movement, in the climate change movement. And I think that that's what being a true and proper ally is. It's not about feeling good. It's not about like Instagram activism, posting things on your story. It's about putting things out there and showing that you are willing to take action to make things better, basically, which can be really difficult. And it can feel like everyone's pushing against you, because sometimes they are. But I think that people that want to do something to make things better, especially within groups like Youth Strike for Climate, within groups like Extinction Rebellion, should sit down and think about whether or not they are being a true ally, whether or not they are doing things to truly make the situation better, or if they're coming, you know, if they're coming to events like this because they feel like education is the biggest step for them in terms of feeling like they're doing the right thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Maris, and agree that I think sometimes you have to be careful about absolving yourself and making yourself feel good by going to educational events without then doing something afterwards as well. So finally, Safia.
Yes, well, I think there are 2 points that I'd like to address to answer this question. I think, first of all, we need to understand that, and we need to be clear that environmentalism is never going to be a neutral movement. It has to be a radical movement. It has to be a political movement, and we need to have a political message. And this is why sometimes when you have environmental movements which are prone to tokenism and just including people of color without questioning the narrative that they are vehiculating, we need to be aware of that. And this is why we need to be clear that we cannot be apolitical when fighting against climate change. I think this is something which is extremely important to take into consideration. Now, the second thing that I wanted to talk about is sort of jumping into how we are taught about activism, racial activists, etc., and hence what sort of activism we are trying to build. There's something that I wanted to share because I'm reading this book, which is extremely interesting, which is called How Nonviolence Protects the State, which I think is now just available in French, unfortunately. I don't know if it has been translated. But what I'd like to address is how you have the dogma of just using non-violent techniques, which deprives you of other tools which have been used by activists in history. And the fact that sometimes it's a very privileged point of view to just say that you are non-violent. So I am not in any ways enticing violence or anything. I'm just saying the way we are seeing activism and the way we are trying to create a movement, we need to demystify these visions, because sometimes, and this is what is being told in this book, is that we have a very revisionist insight into history. For example, using figures like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, which used non-violent tools, and saying that they are the one who liberated, for example, the Black cause in the US or India. But at the same time, they were in line with other groups, such as, for example, in the US, the Black Panther movement, which are seen as more radical, which use other techniques than purely non-violent. And I think that when trying to build an activist group in the global north, and hence seeing what sort of, again, activism while trying to build, the discourse on non-violence is sometimes extremely privileged, and sometimes you need to be able to use non-violence. Like, there was this activist which was this very interesting comparison, which is that if you have a house on fire and you have the pyromaniac just next to it, you're not going to solely rely on non-violence because it's not necessarily going to be adequate. And again, the sort of idea that being non-violent gives you a sort of sense of purity is extremely hypocritical, because let's say that just by buying your clothes, by driving, by taking the train, by taking the plane, you are contributing to another sort of violence, which is institutional violence, etc. So I feel like this is just something that I wanted to maybe add a little bit to this question, because we need to, again, have this, we need to maybe question this idea we have into non-violence. Again, I'm not saying that we should be solely violent, but we need to consider all the techniques that might be useful. And yeah.
Thank you so much. So in the kind of spirit of always taking things from kind of discussion to action, in a way that we've already talked about, a few people are sort of asking things like, what actions can we do right now on an individual level? Someone's raised the example of Instagram accounts to follow, but I guess you guys have raised that Instagram activism shouldn't be where it ends, but just anything that people can do next right now as an individual. And someone else kind of asked, could the speaker summarize by outlining exactly what action or outcome they want to achieve? So I suppose it's about like the kind of, if someone was here at this webinar, what can they then go away and do as an individual to help decolonize the climate movement? So Maya Rose, do you want to answer first?
Sure. So I'd say the first and most obvious thing is just to read, and like I said before, to educate yourself. Not Instagram posts necessarily, although I know I said that they're not great before, but it is a reasonable access point if you are going to go and continue to educate yourself. But I think after, having taught yourself about why this is an issue, why it's something that we have to combat on an intellectual level, I think if you're in environmental spaces, sitting down and having explicit conversations with people about an organization, like I'm sure, for example, a lot of people are part of Extinction Rebellion or Extinction Rebellion Youth who are listening today. And I think going in and thinking about the way that people are facilitating, I suppose, a colonized version of climate change activism. And I suppose having those conversations and self-reflecting. But honestly, I think it's difficult to say like individual things that people can go away and do, because this is a really broad, really systemic issue that's rooted in a lot of historical things, a lot of historical aspects. And unless we see a really, really wide cultural shift in the way that people talk about climate change and the way that people talk about fighting climate change, it's really difficult, which I know isn't like an easy 1, 2, 3 step for people to take away from this. But that's the reality of it. And I guess if you wanted to talk about broader government action that you want to encourage, people are talking a lot about reparations at the moment, which I'm not 100% sure how I stand on that conversation. But again, go away and educate yourself, find out what you think about that. Because that's what it comes down to at the moment until we start seeing that really broad radical action.
Thank you so much. And so, you've mentioned reparations. So I guess I want to go on to Cleo. So what are the next steps we can do?
Yeah, well, I'm very clear about where I stand on reparations, as many people will know, and it's about holistic reparations. It isn't just a payout to people of African descent or African heritage. It's about repairing the harm, and much of that is actually about how we are empowered as a global community to start the repair process ourselves. It's not about asking anyone else to repair us. It's about having things in place so that we can do some of that work, but of course hold institutions to account as well. So I'm very happy that I can give you a very tangible way of action, because we have a motion, which I'm sure you all know what a motion is. It's where a councillor or two asks the city council at large to debate and make a decision on something after some months. And this has been a process led by campaigners for many years actually, and started actually by the late great Bernie Grant MP in London. And we now are in the situation where on Tuesday, which also is the National Black People's Day of Action, which came about, that's 40 years since the New Cross fire in London, where many young teenagers lost their lives in an arson attack. Until this day, there's been no justice, just another manifestation of the injustices against people. So the motion for atonement and reparations for Bristol's role in the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans, TTEA, which is for many of us the preferred term to what is more widely known as the transatlantic slave trade, that lands on Tuesday, and you've still got time to put a statement of support in. I'm going to put the information of that into the chat. Very much welcome you to put your statement in, and you can link it to the ecological and environmental crisis, how the two things are linked, and how perhaps some of you may believe that until we get repair of all of this, we're unlikely to see the repair that we need to the planet, because also, as many of us advocate, social justice and environmental justice go hand in hand, and no manner of diversity and inclusion policies or practices could possibly get everything on a level playing field in the time that is needed. So please do put your statement in. You have until midday on Monday, and it can be very simple. I support the motion because, and a sentence, or I support the motion and a whole paragraph or an essay. So please support the motion. I'm going to put the link now in the chat to the wording of the motion and how you can get involved. And just briefly, one of the overall asks, which campaigners have been calling for many, many years, is actually that the government acknowledge the seriousness of this. That it underpins the racism and rife inequality that we experience and witness, and that we need an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, where an international community can actually give their own account and have the right to be heard. So thank you for listening to that, and I do hope some of you will get a statement in. I'll post that now.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I think it, just to summarise it, really highlights that even though loads of questions have said that as a natural consequence, things like XR, other movements can be made up of many kind of like white people, because it tends to be, you know, that those countries that have perpetuated the climate crisis through their capitalist movements, it's more about, it's true the burden of work needs to often fall on white people as allies, but when you see people of colour here with organisations and movements that they are initiating on this, it's really important to platform them with media, share their posts, like engage with them, educate yourself, and then actually show up for the action. So write in your emails, donate to petitions, call for the funding of organisations that people of colour are trying to head on this. So I think you can turn a lot of what we're saying into practical actions to do right now there as well.
Just to follow quickly on from what you've said, actually, there is a wing of XR, which is the international wing of it, which does support the annual reparations, what was the annual reparations march, but is now the annual reparations rebellion groundings that takes place on the 1st of August in Brixton. And actually the first one last year, the march has been going for about 6 years, but last year it was a groundings, and it was supposed to be occupying the Brixton area. It was members of the allies within XR who actually did start to block the road. So there was a place and a space and a needed action from them.
Thank you. Olivia?
Again, hard to follow such a specific action as that. I think it's a balance between, as Maya Rose said, taking the time to educate yourself, realizing where you are and realizing where you want to be, and kind of, you know, planning that for yourself. For really practical things, I like Intersection Environmentalist, the website, because that broadens my horizon as well. I know my history and my culture, but, you know, just because my culture is different to the mainstream doesn't mean there's not other cultures out there and other things I can learn from. So that's really broadened my horizons. And I think from a Bristol perspective, I'm going to shamelessly plug my own radio show because, you know, we talk to grassroots groups and other voices within the environmental sector around Bristol, and they're learning what's going on in your local environment. I think Bristol has a really good image in some ways of being this green capital, well, it was the green capital, but this green city and green movement. But that's a very particular image of what a green movement looks like. And there's lots of stuff going on that isn't in that mainstream that we help to highlight. So you can show your support through various different ways. We've had groups from St. Paul's on asking for people to vote so they can get funding for their community gardens. So it can be really simple actions like that, where just by listening to a radio show, you realize that something different is going on in your local green space, and you can help to support that in whatever ways. And I think this is really important as well, as an ally, support in ways that people want you to. I think that's quite often, support is great, but you know, there's particular ways that people want that to be done, and there's a whole conversation around the structure of funding and how that works. And, you know, so if people don't want you to give you their money for a very simple phrase, don't do that. Support in the ways that people want them to. So listening to radio stations like Ujima and the Black and Green Ambassador show where they're given that platform is really important, I think, as well.
Thank you so much. Penina?
Yeah, I think it sort of just adds to what has already been said about taking collective community action. And for me, that is also taking collective community action also links into resetting the way that we have understood things. And the decolonization of the mind is not just something that people of African heritage or other indigenous communities have to do themselves. It is about everyone actually taking that concept of resetting their own minds. And actually, I find the concept of allies something that unsettles me, because the concept of allies puts the responsibility back on the victim to get someone to support them, whereas this really should be a shared struggle. A shared struggle is something that, as you know, it manifested itself when we saw the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, the thing that came out was that nobody's safe until everyone is safe. So when we take that mantra and say, no one can ever be safe until everybody is safe, and actually look at ourselves not as allies, but people who have got a shared struggle. Go out there. If you see yourself as an ally, think about what that really means. What does an ally really mean? Why do you see yourself as an ally? Does that concept really go down really well? What makes you an ally? What makes you not another human being, just like the other human being who's also going through the difficult struggles? So I think questioning yourself and your knowledge and the things that you have had to learn and learn some of those on a very individual level, which is part of the education thing. But also the other thing is that collective community action should also bring in holding institutions to account. If you're a student within the university, how are you going to hold the university to account for part of whatever they have, their contribution towards what has happened in terms of trying to repair the harm that has been done to people of African heritage, and also the link to the environmental injustice. So we have to now rise up and hold those institutions to account. There's different ways you can do that. Cleo has hinted towards the campaign that is going on with the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, but also the motion that is going through. But we need to bring it back to our back gardens. The back gardens for me, the university is there. You are in that garden. Hold them to account.
Thank you so much. And finally, Safia.
Yes, well, I think I would like to echo what everyone has just said before, because it's also really, really true. And I would add two things. The first one being, I think that when we are trying to build movements as allyship, or just in the global north in general, we need to be wary of not appropriating discourses which have already been made, because generally I think, especially during the whole Black Lives Matter the month, where people generally knew that there was racism and then it was just gone for the summer, some people would just appropriate some materials that were coined by Black feminist authors, and they would just say that this is something that they are aware of. And I think you need to reference all these materials which have been done for decades, because otherwise you are perpetuating this sort of knowledge domination, as in as a white person, you have discovered what institutionalized racism is. So this is something which we need to be really wary of. And I think the second thing as well, because it can be very frustrating as a student in the global north as well, to not necessarily knowing what to do. I think sort of trying to see, for example, where your money goes and stuff like that is something which is extremely important. And because I have worked, I'm working right now on some divestment actions. I think it's very important for students to understand, for example, that sometimes the money they're paying for their tuition fees goes towards some institutions which are enabling climate change. And I know that People and Planet which I was working with last year, had a campaign called Divest USS, which was precisely on that, the fact that the tuition, that the £9,000 we were paying a year goes to companies that are financing coal and oil and mining industries. So I think sort of knowing that your money is going something, that there's something you can do about it by pressing the people who are literally fueling climate change is something that can be empowering, and that you know that you can do something about that. And at a broader level, there's so much divestment actions that also you can support, because I mean, even things like, for example, like the bank where you have your money and stuff, at the broader level sort of does contribute to climate change. So trying to pressure organization to stop fueling climate change short-term wise can also be something that can be maybe less frustrating and really, really useful as a student.
Thank you so much, Safia. So those are all the questions we've got time for today, but I see that there are a lot more. And we're hoping that after this event that we can maybe follow up with some written responses. So we have saved all of them, and hopefully we can hear a lot of the other important themes that we couldn't cover today. But I want to thank all of our panelists for coming. I think you've raised some really important educational points for us to consider about how to decolonize our mind. It should be in all aspects, but especially in the climate movement, because it is killing people of colour every day. And it's so important to remember that racism and colonialism has impacted this movement, so we must actively fight it in our responses. The other thing I wanted to say is, in terms of like next steps and frustrations around not being able to do anything, I think while we do recognise it's a longer cultural change and you have to educate yourself, the panellists have really kindly provided some excellent resources to go and read and act on in the chat, and I really encourage you to do so, and just to research and have a look for the people of colour who are already trying to combat this and support them in tangible ways, with money or with not money, your time, your protest, your action. I think those are all really easy, tangible things you can do even on an individual level. So finally, just want to say if you have any feedback, just that you can sort of like find the link into the comments in the chat, and to check out the rest of the Climate Day of Action at bristolsu.org.uk/climate emergency. A recording of this event and many of the events today can be found on the SU YouTube channel next week, and stay tuned on like the SU socials for responses to these questions as well. And I also wanted to add to check out the BAME network. I'm chair of the BAME network, and we're doing constant events on anti-racism and on educating yourself about colonialism. So we've got a tough topics discussion series at the moment. We have an event on xenophobia coming up, and I'm working with David, the undergraduate education officer, to form decolonizing working groups across university, so that our whole education becomes decolonial, with practical steps to increase racial representation in our curriculum. So all of that can be found at Bristol BME on Instagram and BAME Network on Facebook. So yeah, we'll finish here, but thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you all have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.